This is the Neoliberal Round podcast entitled Why Don't the Russians Rise Up? A Russian American Perspective. As we draw closer to the end of 2022 and begin to think about 2023, I must say that 2022 was indeed a tough year for many people all over the world, and it continues to be tough for many people. But through it all, we have been able to persevere. And 2021, coming out of 2021, it was a year that we saw how we're just coming out of COVID, and where many people are looking forward to 2022 as we move beyond COVID and things, and we move to normalcy. But as we think about 2022, there wasn't much normalcy, and in fact, I had written and published an article in our news feeds, LinkedIn, the Neoliberal Commentary, Blogger News, so on and so forth, talking about, and the neoliberal.com via our neoliberal post, talking about the economic outlook for 2022. 2022, we saw spike in inflation, one of the highest inflation rates we've ever seen in years, spike in murder, spike in income inequality, spike in poverty, and a quite unusual situation where we see the way in which we think about work is changing. The way in which we organize work is actually changing, we saw that young people were changing how we think about work. And because of COVID, many people wanted to work virtually or remotely. But there's been 2022 was quite interesting. And we learned a lot. And every experience you go through in life provides an opportunity for us to learn. No matter how negative, no matter how difficult, it provides an opportunity for us to learn about ourselves, learn about people, and you always want to make changes. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living, and so you always want to reflect on yourself. You always want to do self-examination, and you want to be very critical of yourself, but you don't want to be too pessimistic, and you also want to think about what you're going to do next year. That's different. But today, as we think about the Neoliberal podcast, we are doing well, but we can do better. And we appreciate all the support that we've been getting throughout the months that we've started, and we're looking forward to improving. We're looking forward to what we can do to improve this show. But as we think about a show that we did, which is partly one of the number one shows. Some time ago, we had talked about what's going on in Russia, and we talked about the fact that Putin believes the West thinks it's of a higher class, and it is not to be trusted, for they only use peoples and treat them as expendables, and that he justifies genocide or murder or killing Ukrainians and those who side with the West as a purification mechanism to strengthen Russia, all of Russia, including the form of Soviet Union. And we even carried a podcast looking at what Russians are saying. But actually, I sat down with a Russian, had a face-to-face with a Russian Ishmael, a couple of days ago, and who refused to have us do a live recording because he was afraid of what the Kremlin or what Putin might or could do. He's an American citizen, but he came here as a boy, I think 10 years old, from Russia. But Ishmael, at first I thought he was Jewish, but as I as I as I engaged with him, and so when I realized he's not Jewish, he's Russian. His grandparents are Ukrainians, but it was quite interesting. He said that he was afraid to have to even do an audio podcast with his voice on the show. We could only sit down, interview, and pen this article and this podcast and discuss some of what he has said. But it's quite interesting. According to Ishmael, so I have a poll. I've added a poll to the podcast. So every time I publish a podcast, sometimes there is, especially on the Anchor platform, which is connected to the Spotify platform. When I publish, you can add a poll, or you can ask a question. And when you go to the Spotify platform and you're playing the podcast, you can go to the community page and there, or the bottom of the podcast, while it's playing, the poll question and the topic questions that I added to the podcast comes up, and you can participate like that as well. You can engage the podcast. So I'm doing a poll, and the question the question I'm asking for the poll is, I ask, why don't the Russians rise up against Putin and his invasion in Ukraine? And so I have I have several options. And you can choose 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or whatever it is. So the correct option 1 is because they support Putin and the war. That's the first option. Second option is because they are too poor and they spend most of their time trying to survive. Third one is because the elites are connected to Putin. The fourth one is because they are on this. I know very little. And the fifth one is undecided. So I have that, and they can choose which one. I think it's more than that, because I don't have it before me, but people can participate by going on the. I think the Spotify platform has the poll and so on. But that's the poll for the podcast, and the title of the podcast is "Why Don't the Russians Rise Up? A Russian American Perspective." Why don't the Russians rise up? A Russian American perspective.
They'll be killed if they rise up. What do you mean? That's a simple answer to that. Russia doesn't tolerate that insubordination, that type of demonstration from their constituents, from their whoever.
Right, because they have a totalitarian system.
Absolutely.
As against the US, which is we can rise up. Some people can rise up. Black Lives Matter rose up, but look what happened to them. They met with another group, a backlash. Because of I don't think the backlash in Russia is the government. They'll be killed. But in order for you to have change, people have to fight for their freedom. People have to be willing to be killed. So what if you're going to be killed? Okay, so you're going to continue to live under totalitarianism, on despotism. You're going to continue to live under tyranny. You're going to continue to live under Putinism. Putin invading other people's lives and holding his people's ransom and making, so many Russians are poor. And many of them are even poorer right now because of the war. Okay? You're going to continue to... So people can accept... you have to be willing you have to be willing to sacrifice. You have to be willing to give your life. You have to be a martyr in order to experience change. You can't be afraid of dying. If you strongly believe that what Putin is doing is wrong, and what he is doing is wrong, what he's doing is genocide. He's invading another country, and there are some people who are justifying it, saying, "Oh, because of they're violating some agreement, some ceremonial agreement between Russia and NATO, and they're inching closer." But of course, we're gonna have that on the podcast today. Ishmael was quite revealing, and I can't wait to share the sit down I have with Ishmael. A Jewish, I believe, he's not just a Russian American, a Jewish Russian American.
Why is that significant?
It is significant because he is a Russian,
okay, and a Jew,
a Jew.
Why is that significant?
Because it is significant because we want to hear their perspective. Somebody from that particular.
Is there additional? Is there more racism towards Jews in Russia? Or is there more, like, they hold a certain status in Russia? Or they, like,
I mean,
what makes, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, they do?
Yes. Oh. Not status. I mean.
Because, and here in America, Jews are looked at, with a certain type of status, like rich and, get over on people.
Part of Putin's problem is the fact that this young man is a Jew.
Is this young man part government?
The president Zelensky is Jewish.
Yes.
That's a problem for
Putin.
Yes. Oh. They didn't want this Jewish Zelensky who was a Jew.
For Putin or the Kremlin?
For the Putin and the Kremlin.
And the Kremlin.
Both. One and the same.
I see.
Okay.
Putin's been in power way too long.
I mean, listen, the fraternity.
Why doesn't Russia have democratic elections?
They do not have.
Why has Putin been in power?
They have elections in Russia.
Putin has seen, Reagan. He's seen George H.W. Bush. He's seen George W. Bush.
No, but he had to step down.
He's seen Bill Clinton.
But he also stepped down.
Barack Obama, Donald Trump.
Yes.
Joe Biden. He's been president through all these presidents.
But now he was prime minister and then president, and then it was president, prime minister, and then back to president.
They aren't one and the same?
No.
Prime minister and president?
No, they're different.
Who holds more power? The prime minister?
The president.
The president.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see. So in British, the prime minister doesn't hold the power?
The prime minister holds the power in Britain.
Yeah.
But there is a queen or a king that
they hold no power. They're irrelevant.
They are, to be honest, we think they don't have.
Bring up,
you think,
Queen Elizabeth,
excuse me, you think they don't have power, but they have power.
King Charles. They're just symbolic figures.
The symbol is in everything in that culture. That's why you have to study the culture of a society. When you study the culture, you see that, listen, they have all the power. They have all the power. Okay? Who you think run the government? The nobles. Who is the head of the nobles? The king and the queen, they are one and the same. So they don't hold no power, but they set it up in a certain way now, in a particular way now. So the head of the house, who's the head of the monarchy? The king or the queen? Okay, who runs all of these heads of government and the military?
It's just a symbolic thing.
Yeah, it's symbolic. You think because it's symbolic, but it's more than
Thank
symbolic.
you.
We will do a podcast on that. This podcast is not about that.
Oh yes.
But when you start to study who are all these nobles? These guys are all nobles, and who is the head of the nobles? The king and the queen. And the head of all these committees is run by the king and the queen. So yes, in one sense they're elected, but there are these nobles who run these heads of departments and so on. They're okay. So just so you know. But we'll be right back after this. We'll be right back after this. This show promises to be great. To be quite powerful and quite revealing. As I share with you the discussion I had with Ishmael, Jewish, Russian, American perspective. let's continue with the episode. We'll continue from where we left off. And this is quite interesting. Many Russians, the relationship between the former Soviet USSR countries, the relationship is very powerfully strong. His grandparents are Ukrainians, but he's Russian. And I did indicate to you that we needed to do a follow-up story about what's going on in Russia. But Russians are against the war, but they won't say it because they're afraid of what the Kremlin might do to them. And some time ago we said, why is it that, and even many Americans and many people who don't live in the region and know what's going on, they say, why is it that the Russians don't rise up? Why is it that they don't rise up against Putin? Against Putin? Precisely, lack of research. They are poor, and if you look at Russia, is a poor country. Although you have some oligarchs. You have, in fact, who owned Chelsea? It was a Russian. The Chelsea Football Club was owned by a Russian. And I had said that, and in fact, I had wrongly reported that, if the Russian oligarchs, were to wedge themselves, or or not to throw them, if they were to wedge themselves from Putin, or if Putin were to lack their support, then that would see Putin's demise. But that's not going to happen when Russia is behind the oligarchs' wealth. Okay? When they are part of the fraternity. That's not going to happen. Okay? Some time ago, we said that Russia celebrated what? They have 100 millionaires. But still, 100 millionaires, but how many people live below the poverty line in Russia? Hundreds of millions. In fact, when I spoke with Ishmael said, say for example, in Russia, there's no they have washing machines, but they cannot even afford to buy one. They can't even afford to buy a washing machine. In Russia, the Russians are so poor. Many Russians are so poor, they spend most of their time trying to survive to make ends meet. Most of their time. That's all they do. They don't have time to be rising up.
Sounds like every country, though.
Yes, but this is worse in Russia. Because Russia is supposed to be it's supposed to be one of the post-industrial countries. Okay? And in fact, okay, fine. There was some kind of demonstration in Russia some time ago, but this is far in between. And the Russians and the Kremlin and Putin quickly stomped out the uprising. You don't hear much demonstrations now. Okay. You don't find
the Russian-Ukraine war is still going on?
Yes, it is still going on.
You don't hear too much about it.
It's still going on though. Still going on today. And the latest is that President Biden actually just agreed to send some defensive military equipment.
Again?
But no, not again. They never did.
No, they have to be up to $1 trillion in military aid.
Oh yes, and I mean that's one. Many Americans were opposed to that.
Yeah, I'm opposed to that
because of what's going on in America.
Right, I'm opposed to that.
People,
sending too much money to fucking Ukraine.
Precisely, too much money when people are struggling here in the U.S. and if they were to and not only are they struggling, they're fine. They're struggling. If they have the money to send the Russia to Ukraine, that means they have the money to send to give to Americans. But they fight against any stimulus package to help Americans here who are trying to make ends meet during COVID and so on. But they have the money, trillions of dollars to send. But but I said to you, we have a responsibility to help our neighbors, okay? And we shouldn't allow the political infightings in our country to affect how we give to other people. But it doesn't look good though. It does not look. It's not a very good picture. Of course, people will complain about that. Okay. But that's one of the But one of the things that he said that Many people want to think that we should replace Russia. I mean, we should replacing Putin will help, will stop the war. And I'm one of those persons who had reported that. If the people were to rise up against Putin, then this war would end. Putin is, and guess what? That's not true. That is not true. Replacing Putin will not stop. Okay? In fact, if Putin never had all the support that he had, okay? But probably we would not have had this. But because Putin knows he has the support, and even if we replace him, his generals, the people around him, his fraternity, the fraternity. In fact, Putin is just the head of the fraternity. But Putin is the head of the fraternity that share his ideology and his modus operandi. Replacing Putin. Putin replace who? Okay, who would replace Putin? His second? The very same people who's part of the who shares his ideology. Putin is part of a fraternity who are people who wants the XAB. I mean, so who wants people who are ex-KGB who want the old Russia back. They're ex-KGB who want the old Russia back, and that's what Ishmael alluded to. They're all ex-KGB. Ishmael was the person, the Russian. He's from.
That you interviewed?
That I interviewed.
Oh, okay.
And he was afraid to come on air, but he was willing to talk with me, to discuss with me about what's going on in Russia. And he said his grandparents, they're from Russia.
Is Ishmael alias? That's his real name.
That's his real name.
Oh.
But at first I thought he was Jewish. But I believe he's Jewish. There are Jewish people that lived in Russia. And I'm pleased to remember that in Ukraine, the President Zelensky of Ukraine is Jewish. Okay, so there is Jewish. So I would think then that he's Jewish. Being Jewish doesn't necessarily mean being Jewish doesn't necessarily mean that you're not Russian. So probably he's a Russian Jew, but he is a Jew. He's been living in the U.S. since he was 10 years old. He's a national of this country, of the U.S. But he still has fears about Russia. He can't speak against the Russian war because he's afraid that he might be drafted into the war. He said all Russian men, once you are a Russian man, once you get to 18, you're drafted into the war. And he's afraid to speak publicly because he's afraid that if he speaks against the war, his parents, his family in Russia will be imprisoned or jailed because of what he will say, because it's going to be found that they're going to find who his family members are. So that's part of the problem. You see that? So he can't speak against that. That's why the Russians can't rise up against the war in the ways that we think that they should. They don't have the freedoms that we have in that totalitarian country that's run not just by a despot, but by a despotic fraternal group. Not in the term. I'm in a fraternity. I'm pledged in a fraternity. If I did a single, that doesn't necessarily mean that's not the kind of fraternity we're talking about. We're talking about a KGB, a fraternity of ex-KGB people who have a particular kind of ideology, who runs Russia with an iron fist, whose people cannot speak or challenge the people who are supposed to be serving them. He can't speak against them. So it's not just that they are poor as well, but they can't speak against Russia, because if they speak against Russia, Mother Russia, I mean, if they speak against Putin and what he's doing and his fraternity, they're speaking against Mother Russia. But can I tell you, he spoke with such passion against Putin, against Kremlin. He spoke with such anger. He was so angry as I spoke with him, man, about what's going on in Russia. But he was also upset that he could not. But what about martyrdom? Where are the martyrs in Russia? Huh? That's how civilizations. That's how freedom is won. But what they have done, can I tell you, the Kremlin and Putin and his boys, they are so smart. What they have done, they have made. Let me tell you. It is okay if many Russians are lumpen part. Okay, are part of the lumpen proletariat. It's okay if Russians are dependent on their government and live in poverty. It's okay. That's the kind of Russia you want, so that you can control the people, so that they can spend most of their time trying to make ends meet instead of trying to fight their government. That is okay. That's what many of these you learn about totalitarian system. In a totalitarian system where you have despotic government, okay, who run amok of everybody's life, who are unchallenged, whose power is unchallenged and unmitigated. This is only facilitated within a system that is organized in such a way that allows for that to happen. They control the narrative, they control communication, they control the news, they control the news cycle, and people's access to information. Okay? And it is okay if you have people who are poor, because people who are poor cannot spend their time challenging the government. Okay? And he alludes to this very nature. That is how you organize society. So a society, so this is quite interesting as I study power, privilege, and position. People who are poor, or people who, society, people who have much to gain from poverty and high income levels of income inequality will not want to do anything about poverty and poor people. Because they spend their time trying to make ends meet, which is a strategy. A strategy. Many Russians are poor because it is a strategy of convenience. A strategy. Okay, there is an ulterior motive here. But whichever the case is, we know that Russians are against the war, but won't say anything because they're afraid of what might happen to them, or because they don't have the resources, because they are poor, and they are poor because it is made because society it provides advantages for certain people in society. And then you find out that many of the oligarchs and the elites in Russia, the few elites who are in Russia, they are rich because their wealth comes from the Kremlin. We are learning. That's what he said. He said that, say for example, the guy who sold, he was quick to sell that because he was willing to sell the Chelsea Football Club. He was already rich. He had made his wealth from diamonds. From diamonds, that's what he said. He made his wealth from diamonds. Through illegal means, or through inhumane means, through violence. And then he bought Chelsea Football Club. And then because of his connections to Russia after the Russian invasion and the international pressure, and wanted to save face, he instead of speaking against Putin, yes, and standing up against Putin and the war, what he did, he sold Chelsea Football Club instead of challenging Putin, because he can't challenge Putin. These oligarchs, these elites, they can't challenge Putin. They can't divorce themselves and disengage themselves from Putin. They can't rise up against Putin either, because Putin made them rich, or not Putin and his fraternity. Putin is just the head of the fraternity, the president of the fraternity that runs Russia. And they themselves are part of that very fraternity. So they can't speak against their fraternity. So it won't happen. He'll rather sell the Chelsea Football Club, and that's exactly what Ishmael alludes to. So it's you see the dilemma here. You talk of the elites won't rise up against Putin and his project. a project that Donald Trump himself tried here in the U.S. But it won't work. You know why? Because our society here in the U.S. is arranged arranged differently. Although it in some way it works in subtle ways. In subtle ways it works because they come up with ceremonies. Yes, to punish a group of people, the masterminds behind the January 6th insurrection. They are still walking away at large, living big lives, doing shows on Fox, dancing with the stars, so on and so forth. Yes, that's what they are doing. The masterminds behind the violent insurrection. And then they develop ceremonies, committees, and then make recommendations that have no legal bearing. That's what happened here in the year, but in Russia while in Russia they won't rise up because they don't have information, or the information that they have is controlled by the same people who are justifying their invasion or their terrorism of other people. Now, there is one last thing that he alludes to that I must say, which was quite interesting and quite important. He said that he's a citizen, yet he's still considered Russian to Russia. And
he's a citizen, get what?
But he's still Russian.
Of course he is.
You know, he's still considered
You're
Russian.
You're a citizen, but you're still Jamaican.
I mean, not in that sense.
What do you mean?
Jamaica has no hold over me, but Russia still has hold over him. If I can speak against Jamaica, but then they can't do anything against to my family. If he doesn't have the luxury to speak in a public, I can speak. I can have a podcast and write about Jamaica in the way that I do, but he can't. Okay, he can't come on the show and speak publicly because of fears because of what might happen. And then he said to me that, okay, say for example, is there an opposition party? He said, okay, fine. There is an opposition party. The leader of the Green Party in Russia. Well, who is the leader and where is he? He is in jail right now, and he's gonna die in jail. So if there is an opposition, you won't survive long. You won't last long. So you might as well. It's either you join them, yes, or you die in jail. But he's here. But his grandparents are Ukrainians. But he's from Russia. Okay, and you find that that's the situation happening. But he won't speak. He won't speak against Russia. And if he was to travel to Russia, if he were to visit Russia as an American, he might be drafted.
How? You mean he would have been kidnapped? He can't be drafted. He's no longer Russian unless he holds dual citizenship.
He's considered Russian. Look what's going on in the Ukraine. Okay, Ukraine. He said to me, one of the problem with, if one is to justify the Russian war, one can own the argument for the Russian war is this: that NATO broke the agreement with Russia. Okay, the fact that they are inching closer and closer, and even closer to the Russian border. They are inching closer and closer to the Russian border, which threatens Russian dominance and Russian expansion in the region and control of the region. But this inching closer and closer also stems from the fact that Ukraine's interest in NATO and their relationship with the West. And not only that, many Russians are adopting, as I said, Western values. And that's part of the problem. He said many Russians are adopting Western values. He said that's part of the problem. Watching TV and American shows and so on and so forth. And now they have banned all of that from Russia now. Because part of the problem was that the Russia was becoming too Western, too American. Many of the young people and so they were becoming too adopting Western values and Western styles. So it was a show of force. So he was so against that. quite powerful, and that's what's going on in Russia. I promised that I needed us to have a show that speaks to Russia, and we will continue with part 2 of looking at Donald Ducky Burks, the risk taker, with a reading from his book. But we had to do a follow-up story as we wrap up the year, because as we look at the year, our number one story was looking at what happened in Russia, and I think we did we did carry some shows looking at what's going on in Russia. But it was good to sit down with a Russian who it was closely connected, because we didn't really sit down with any Russian. Most of the information that we got coming out of Russia from as early as in April or February of this year, we got it thanks to Babel and our associations with people from Babel and from Ukraine, people on the ground. We also had access to Telegram and some information that we were able to, I was able to provide some reports to you. And we had to provide some follow-up, but we weren't, and so we got some of the stories that we reported to you about what's going on in Russia came from sources that we have on the ground in Russia, and from people we spoke to, from some members of my church congregation, are also relatives to people in Ukraine. But I never had a chance to actually sit down to speak with a Russian, and we were able to sit down with Ishmael. And boy, he talked with such passion, with such energy, with such disgust against this war. But he was, of course, afraid to come on air to talk with me directly. But I wanted to reach out to Ishmael and just let him know how appreciative we are of him coming on the show or sitting down with me for those 20 minutes, 25 minutes, talking about what's going on in Russia and how many people feel in Russia about the Russian war, and why is it that many Russians cannot rise up against Putin, and why is it that it's so difficult to replace Putin, and where is the opposition? Where are the opposition? They're in jail rotting. and okay, which goes to show, if you were to consider running against Putin, you can forget about it. Okay? This is the Neoliberal Realm podcast. Before the end of the year, we will continue. We will have at least 3 or 4 more shows for you. Thank you for listening to us, and of course, support us by going to https://anchor.fm/theneoliberal/report and visit us at www.theneoliberal.com or renaldocmckenzie.com. And of course, grab a copy of my book, Neoliberalism, Globalization, Income Inequality, Poverty and Resistance, available worldwide in all platforms. And my second book, Neoliberal Globalization Reconsidered, out in, we had said January 2023, but I'm going to update that. The book won't be out until February 28, 2023. And the reason why I am updating that, it's because I added a dedication page at the beginning of the book, which some of you may know, and I think I did an excerpt of that of my book, and in the dedication I said I dedicate this book to my dad, who was given a basic education up to the grade 9, up to the 9th grade, where he could and needed only to barely read, write, or spell. Yet the expectations on him were great: to become an adult, raise a family while working in an industry requiring basic education, getting base pay, but through trial and error, raise 6 successful children, one of whom has written Neoliberalism and is about to release this book. The cycle would continue, but some slip through the cracks, now working to make it better and bigger for those coming behind us until there's nothing to hold us back. And I will publish, so this book will be released on February 2028, and it promises to be dynamic and powerful and very erudite and academic as usual. I wish you all the best for the new year. Walk good.